Hello everyone, this is Aidy's Game Log episode 2, recorded on the 8th of December 2016. Do we need to change the way the video games industry reviews its games? If you look at what's happened of late, you look at the likes of Bethesda have decided what their review policy is going to be and how they're going to release games to reviewers to review in the future. We've seen this with other companies as well. And I start to wonder to myself, is this an indication really of the games industry itself trying to impose some sort of system in place in order to try to prevent games from being reviewed before any kind of substantial patch is issued, which can remedy some of the issues that may prejudice a review if, in the traditional way, game reviewers from major media outlets and websites get hold of an early copy of the game. And this is a very tricky question to answer with any degree of authority and even fairness, because one has to acknowledge that the games industry has changed. If we look at the basic, almost knee-jerk response to that, would be to turn around and say, no, a game should be released in a finished state. It should be complete, and it should be in a playable state, and it also shouldn't need a 15, 20, 25 gig day one patch in order to remedy issues that should have been filtered out during the development process with adequate QA. But that is an idealistic world, and it doesn't reflect the reality of the world that we're in now. In the past, post-release patches were now impossible to apply to a game, especially those that were released on a games console, simply because the majority of games consoles 20 years ago weren't connected to the internet in any way, shape or form. Now, that's changed. Now there is a considerable proportion of games consoles are connected to the internet, and so the issue of post-release patches is no longer restricted to the fact that the console can't connect to the internet, and so therefore it has to work. That's no longer an overriding issue. It's a bit of a different thing with PCs, but even if you go back a number of years, issuing patches on PCs was difficult because the internet, up until the advent of broadband, was a very, very slow method to deliver data, and especially the type of size of data that was required to patch video games. Admittedly, games were a lot smaller back then, and therefore the data content of each patch would be limited. But you usually found that patches would be issued, or fixes would be issued, via cover discs on magazines. For example, that was one method of delivery. And another method of delivery, again, was a rudimentary form of file transfer on the internet. But then we live in a very, very different world now. We live in a far more connected world, and it's one of the things that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think it's inevitable. Even though games consoles allegedly don't require internet connection to function, and allegedly certain games that are released on these consoles don't require an internet connection to function, I think the reality is quite a way away from that. And how long do we pretend that the reality is a world where we can unplug a console from the internet and expect to have the same game experience as one that is connected to the internet? The simple answer is, it isn't. And so therefore, the way that games have been made has substantially changed because of the fact that releasing post-release content and patches is something now which is considered to be the norm, whether you like it or not. And personally speaking, I don't like it. It is the reality. The rising costs in game development has also dictated that a truncated development time is almost born out of necessity due to pressure from investors and those who actually provide the finances to be able to make some of these games possible. It's not like it used to be, whereby video game companies would have a considerable more disposable income to throw at games, and therefore didn't always have to meet certain financial period end targets, and games could therefore be completed within a reasonable timescale to allow them to be fully functional. That's no longer the case. Game companies are under far more financial scrutiny, with shareholders and investors holding game companies accountable for financial performances within certain periods because their interest stops at nothing more than obtaining a sizable dividend at the end of the year. So game development now is not dictated to by the time it takes to develop the game as such, but almost the time it takes for them to develop a game within a certain financial period and to hit key targets. This is where it results in a game pretty much being launched before it's had adequate QA. And this is simply because they have to meet that target. If the game works, then usually it's at that point the game will be released, knowing that the additional time it can take post the game going gold can be spent post the game going gold to the point where it's actually released. That additional time can be spent ironing out as many problems as possible, and simply issuing a day one patch will remedy most of the legacy issues that have been carried over from that release code. Now, if you think about that, if you release that game to a review company or whoever early, it's going to present itself as something of a bit of a challenge because that day one patch is not going to be available. If that means that the game that's being reviewed is more broken, has more issues, especially those of a technical nature, then that's going to have to be reflected in the final review and the review score for the game. And this then presents a challenge that review copy of the game might bear very little in terms of technical performance and even in some cases available features than the final game itself that is shipped to the consumers on launch day. Now, it's not a perfect system by any means, but I mean it's better that than having a system whereby review scores aren't accurate, and I can see a lot of merit in what certain companies are trying to do, even if I don't agree with it. You have to also see they're trying to do certain things for a reason. So one of the things that I thought would be a workable way around it, but it's also full of pitfalls, and it's a thing that the industry never really does, and I think it should do because it has to reflect the way that making games has moved on since the olden days, is to actually review a game 2, 3, maybe even as far as 6 months post-launch, when patches have been applied to it, and then judge the game then on what it is. One of the recent examples is I picked up a cheap copy of Homefront The Revolution, I think that's what it's called. Yep, on the Xbox One. Now, when it was launched, there were a myriad of technical issues that affected the game. But upon playing the game, it downloaded at about a 10 gig patch, and I've not come up against any of the technical issues such as frame rate, AI running on the spot, or any of that kind of weird stuff that was highlighted when the game was first released. And so therefore it is a very different experience. I've actually quite enjoyed it. I didn't pay full price for it. I did buy it new for $12.99. But at the same time, the game itself works. A lot of the issues have been fixed. It's fair to say that the developers didn't just down tools when the game was finished and go on holiday. They've continued to work on improving the product. And that's the thing that I think often doesn't happen when we review games. There's no credit given to the fact that game developers do continue to work on the game post-launch. If you look at Drive Club as a classic case in point, a game that launched that was so fundamentally broken, it was heavily criticised and ridiculed. But it was interesting to note that people revisiting the game a couple of years later after the studio was closed down by Sony, it was interesting to note how many of them lauded the game, the state it was in post-launch, with the work that had ongoing work as well that had been carried out over well over a 12-month period on the game, had transformed it from something that was being laughed at because certain things didn't work in it, to it actually being defined as one of the best racing games in recent years. Now, that's the great shame of it, and it's that type of thing that also sets me thinking. No Man's Sky is yet another example. In the past 3 months, Hello Games and Sean Murray have kept their heads down and have been busy working on trying to improve the game, and a game that garnered so much hysterical criticism and judgment upon its launch, they've now added features into it. I think what a lot of people may not have understood when they bought No Man's Sky was they were buying the basis of a game, not a complete game experience. They were buying a starting point. And it's interesting to note that when putting the game in after the latest patch was downloaded, there was a note there to say, look, even the additional features such as base building and the ability to have freighters and all of this in the game now, it's just a starting point. This is an ongoing thing. And gaming has changed. It's become more of a continuously evolving platform. And so the concepts of reviewing games, as they used to be, where you would treat each individual game as a standalone unit with what you see is what you get, and the fact that the game wouldn't change at all during the life of its existence, we're slowly moving away from that. And my belief is that game reviews and the way that games are reviewed need to be reflected on that. I think that games should be revisited whenever there is a major update, and the game score should be amended in order to reflect any merits or failures of that update. It's not just about inflating the score if it makes the game better, but it could also be reducing the score if features are taken out or changed which make the game experience worse. We don't live in that boxed off world in gaming anymore that we used to, as frustrating as that may be for many of us older gamers in particular, who were used to just spending our money, putting the game in and having a stress-free gaming experience. But you can't live in a world that doesn't exist anymore, and we're never going to end up going back to that. The nature of games has changed so much, and the new generation of gamers that are coming through are used to the new way of things. They're not used to the old way of a game never getting modded, a game never getting patched, a game not ever having additional content available to it. That for them is a strange concept, and as weird as it might be for us old timers, for the younger generation of gamers coming through, a game not having DLC, not having season passes, not having patches, not being a work in progress would be strange. It would be equally as strange as the concept of releasing an unfinished game is strange to us. Now that doesn't mean to say it's right, but that's the reality of the situation. And I would like to think that going forward, the games media, rather than continue its march into obscurity in what it's doing at the moment, would actually take a step back and look at the nature of how game development has gone and change accordingly, and make sure that going forward they take some form of appraisal for a game that does fundamentally change over its life cycle, rather than just uphold the original score of a game when it launched as being that which is still applicable 12 months, 18 months down the line after DLC and substantial changes have been applied to the game. Now this isn't going to affect every single game, but I've highlighted a couple of 3 cases there where I think that a revisit to the game itself could have markedly affected how the game was received, and could markedly affect as well people's decision to buy the game. One of the reasons a game tends to disappear from public attention is when it literally disappears from public attention, when it doesn't get coverage anymore, where magazines aren't talking about it, when online publications are not talking about it, and when YouTubers are not talking about it anymore. And that is a great shame. There's been many games I've gone back to play because I've come across somebody talking about a game months, maybe even a year, 2, 3 years after it's been launched, and eulogising just how good a game it actually is. I've then hunted down a copy of that game and enjoyed playing it. And I think this notion that games only have a life cycle of 1 or 2 months post-launch, aside from that, then they're deemed to be a failure if they don't hit magic target numbers by an allotted date, is a ludicrous and outdated notion. And if we want to see more games, if we want to see more companies survive, and want to see the games industry flourish in a different world rather than it continue to struggling with one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world in terms of gaming, then attitudes need to change as a whole. It doesn't mean to say you have to be happy. It doesn't mean to say you have to accept games being released being broken. But I think rather than just being dismissive out of the box about games that do escape rather than be launched, perhaps take a little bit of a step back and look at the wider issue, and just try to be fair by games because of a changed situation, because of the way that game development has changed. And if we can do that, well, maybe the games industry will actually start to get better. Maybe things will start to get better rather than us butting up heads against the process all the time. Anyway, thanks for listening, and stay tuned for my next one.